Okay. All right, folks. So we are into our next unit on Chicanx and Latinx individuals or communities in the United States. This is going to be a very broad overview, and it's going to encompass a lot of time, like with African Americans in the United States. So bear with me on a lot of the historical facts. A lot of this is meant to give broader social context and history towards this community, which will also help us understand the current issues that they face. And that's where we're going to round off with, like how we did with the discussion on Black Lives Matter and African Americans in the United States. So let's get into the material and then we can kind of discuss this further. So what we're going to cover today is what is Chicanx and Latinx, and that term has evolved historically, and we'll probably actually ponder this question over the next couple of lectures, just so that way we can kind of flesh out or unearth what these terms actually mean, because Chicanx and Latinx individuals did not consider themselves as such, and there's been a lot of different historical precedents that have caused individuals to think about themselves in that way. We're going to cover a lot on early American history, particularly with Mesoamerica and indigeneity, Spanish colonial role, and race, what that European conquest did to our understandings of race within this community and then across kind of Latin America. This emergence of this idea of mestizo and what that actually means, and that's very complicated in of itself. Latin American independence and the new Latin America. Latin American independence is a little bit after American independence, and its independence is distinct in a lot of ways. So we want to discuss what that means, both because of its newness and its difference or distinctness. We want to be clear that we understand that in relationship to the United States, we want to think about the US's involvement in Latin America in two key wars, the Spanish-American War and the US-Mexico War, what that means for the Southwest and Mexican Americans, and then early trends in migration and racialization for these communities in the 20th century, okay? There are three key terms that we'll be focusing on today. One is going to be mestizo and mestizaje, which is considered to be the largest cultural mixing in the world, which took place in Latin America. This idea of self-determination, and this comes out of the independence movements in Latin America. And self-determination is just a belief and or right of people to freely determine their political, social, and economic development. That's very key, especially today as we're having conversations about American or Western involvement in other countries. We can think about this with regard to Afghanistan and the withdrawal of individuals, and now the Taliban and other, political, regardless of their kind of cultural and or legal frameworks, what it actually means to determine what you want for your country, and how that actually meshes with other countries. And what this is going to be important for, especially when we get into Harvest of Empire and we look at neocolonialism, is does these large Western powers like Europe, America, so on and so forth, enable or allow countries that are seeking independence to actually have them or allow them to determine themselves or have this sense of self-determination outside of what other foreign powers want. And then lastly, we're going to look at push and pull migration. This is very important because I think migration is talked about in a very superficial sense. And what I mean by that is we just think of migration as this process of people moving. And rather, what scholars have noted in ethnic studies, sociology, anthropology, and a variety of other academic fields is that there are a lot of factors that drive people to move from country to country. And I want to be very clear, and I want to be very deliberate in talking about migration, especially from country to country, that this is not a simple process. A lot of people, I think, believe that migration just happens because, and yes, human beings have moved all over the world for hundreds of thousands of years. But especially today, given um, the heavy ties to our national origin, so America, Mexico, Cuba, you know, countries in Africa, countries in Asia, so on and so forth, it's not as easy to move because our identity as human beings is very much tied to that nation that we live in. Secondly, it takes a lot of capital and infrastructure, right? It takes a lot of money to move and start over somewhere else. Countries don't necessarily have programs in place to integrate individuals, and nor do they provide resources and supports for migrants. So given that, we want to be very clear that there are factors that push people out of their country, right? Which can be like war, economic strife, gangs, like we've seen in Central America, shifts in political regimes, as we've seen in the Middle East. And then there are pull factors, right? Does the country itself actually want those folks, right? So are there programs in place, or is there job opportunities in place, so on and so forth, that will encourage migration to certain locations, right? Because, for example, Mexicans could travel south for better economic opportunities, but because Central America and South America aren't necessarily or don't necessarily have the same economic opportunities as America, it makes much more sense for Mexicans to travel north, right? And there are also historical patterns in place for this, right? The same reason why there are a lot of folks from the continent of Africa that travel to Europe versus America, right? It's much closer. There may be economic opportunities for them. There may be historical patterns in place, so on and so forth, right? So we always going to keep that in context when we're thinking about migration in the US. Okay, so what is Chicanx and Latinx? This group encompasses one of the largest ethnic groups in the US, okay? So we are on pace, or Chicanos and Latinos are on pace to match any other ethnic group in the US. And we have been seeing what is called the browning of states, okay? So the browning of states means that in California, for example, and I believe soon in Texas and other locations, we are going to see more folks who identify as, you know, Chicano, Latino, Hispanic, Chicanx, Latinx, whatever that terminology is, in those countries. California right now, I believe, is about 39% Latino or Latinx, Chicanx identified, which is outpaced the existing white population, which is roughly about 38%, right? This is an ethnicity, okay? And we want to make sure that we're always clear that this is an ethnic group, not a race group, right? So remember that race is based on colorism, and colorism has that kind of original framework of white, yellow, black, and red. Brown came in a little bit later to encompass Malays, but what we understand as brown people today comes from whites and indigenous or Native Americans, right? So whites were here because of Spanish colonization, like with European colonization or British colonization in the United States and French colonization in Canada. And then obviously indigenous communities had lived here for hundreds of thousands of years beforehand. And if you remember back to our conversation about race and racialization, part of the reason why it was very difficult to enslave and colonize indigenous peoples because they had lived here for almost 200,000 years prior to conquest. This ethnicity also encompasses the widest range of languages, religions, and cultural practices of any other minority group. And this is also very important to think about, okay? There are a lot of Hispanics in the United States who do not speak Spanish, or there's a lot of Chicanx and Latinx people who do not speak Spanish. They also speak a hybrid language called Spanglish. There are folks who speak various forms of Spanish, right? So there's Caribbean Spanish, there's Mexican Spanish, there's Central American Spanish, there's South American Spanish, right? And there's also Castilian Spaniard Spanish, okay? Those are all different dialectical forms. With that, there are a dozen different indigenous dialects that are throughout all of Latin America. Some are like Nahuatl, right? I'm going to forget the one from the Incans. But anyways, there are a lot of different presence there. Many Latinos consider themselves to be Catholic, and there's a lot of influence from the Catholic Church due to colonization. However, we have seen expansions with that in terms of a growing presence of Mormons and other Christian subsets. there's a lot of heavy influence from indigeneity. You guys will be coming up on a very historic holiday called Dia de los Muertos. Dia de los Muertos actually has indigenous roots. Part of the way that Spanish colonizers got indigenous people to buy into being Christianized was for allowing them to celebrate their cultural holidays. Dia de los Muertos is actually a indigenous holiday that was recognized by the Spanish Church or the Catholic Church, and was celebrated alongside other holidays like Christmas, so on and so forth. Dia de los Muertos is not celebrated in Spain or in the Caribbean. It is indicatively of the continental Western Hemisphere, and it has a lot of nuances, whether it's in Mexico, Central America, or South America. Part of the reason why it's very important for indigenous people, and I'm only going to talk about this briefly here, this isn't a part of the larger lecture, but part of the reason why it's important for indigenous people is because indigenous people did not believe in death the same way that Christians do. A lot of indigenous people believe in a more complex life after death. If you've seen Coco, for example, the movie that was popularized a couple of years ago, the land of the dead, as mentioned in the film, is this kind of afterlife with a complex society. And so many non-Western belief structures and religions do not treat death as an ultimate ending, rather just a transformation of life, right? And so again, within that context of religion, there's a lot of differences there. And in terms of cultural practices, it's the same, right? So there are a lot of diversity in terms of what you celebrate, what you eat, how you eat, so on and so forth. Some communities eat tortillas, some eat bolillos, some eat mostly pork, some eat mostly beef, some are inherently vegetarian. And actually there's a lot of historical work trying to show that many of the indigenous societies in Latin America were actually inherently vegetarian, relying mostly on what were called the three sisters: squash, beans, and corn. And so again, multitude of diversity in this community, but not really comported within the normal structures of an ethnicity and race, given that diversity. And it's constantly evolving. We are seeing much more biraciality and multiraciality in there. There are a lot of interracial marriages going on. We're seeing these new emergences of African-American and Latino communities. There are already existing Afro-Latino communities. There are Asian Latino communities. There are a lot of folks that are trying to reclaim their indigeneity, so on and so forth. And so because of that diversity, it's very important to recognize that. And so as we go back in history, which we're going to do in this lecture specifically, we're going to unpack some of that. And then that's going to help us think about what has been the historic mistreatment of this community along this this diversity of ethnicity, which has really kept them out of what we now know as historic or political or legal whiteness. And remember that legal whiteness is one of the easiest ways to be considered a citizen. Go back to the Thin Ozawa legal case. In this situation, right, because this diversity and frankly, it's kind of mixing or Latinos mixing with other groups, it's kept them largely out of whiteness. So Mesoamerica is a gigantic territorial and cultural area. What I've provided you here on the right is some examples of this in terms of the types of indigenous communities and what they were there, or what was happening in different locations. But like with what would become the US, there was a huge amounts of indigenous tribal groups throughout Latin America. There were four major ones: the Aztecs, Mayas, Olmecs, and Incans. But these four groups, distinct in some ways, were actually very similar. Okay, so they had philosophical systems, writing systems, they had science, they had mathematics, many of them had universities. They had huge architecture, art, so on and so forth. And so these were very, very established societies and civilizations, again, being in existence for well over, several thousand years, right? again, kind of vast in terms of their cultural traits, right? Many of them have aqueducts and trade routes. You'll read a chapter of this a little bit later in the course by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, but in her book, Indigenous Peoples, History of the United States, she notes that there were these complex trade routes from parts of Latin America into North America, where they were finding tropical bird feathers in native headdresses in Alaska that were coming from parts of Central America. Sadly, though, huge swaths of indigenous populations were killed off largely because of Columbus and the ensuing colonization that happened shortly afterwards. I provide here a graph showing native decline from the University of Wisconsin, showing that there was about 125 million indigenous people here in the the continental Americas, and that declined to about 3 million. If you ever want to watch something very comical, John Leguizamo, who is a very famous Colombian and Puerto Rican comedian and actor, did a special for Netflix called Latino History for Morons, and he notes that at one point in time, we had about 70 million indigenous people here in the US, and that declined to about 30, about 3.5 million people. And so we've seen this gigantic population, which again had pyramids, had architecture, had art, culture, science, math. Indigenous peoples were noted, Indigenous peoples of America were noted as creating the concept of zero, and actually had the first metric system far before any other Western society. They had a formalized calendar. You've seen that big sundial, right, which was the Aztec and Mayan calendar. So all of these systems were already in place prior to conquest, and much of that was destroyed due to colonization. The Spanish colonial and Encomienda, Gasta, and race eras ushered in a new sense of political and social organizational systems here in the country. So the Spanish colonial rule gave rise to two important race systems throughout Latin America. First is the Encomienda system. And this is important to know because it is very similar to a chattel slavery system, although the Encomienda system was largely indigenous centered, and they did have a form of chattel slavery. It was a bit distinct than what we saw in the United States. But essentially the Encomienda system was a grant by the Spanish crown to settle the land, or what would be Mesoamerica, Christianize all of the indigenous people, and create a labor system where the existing, a labor system where Spanish settlers would be the kind of overseers of indigenous labor. And so the Spaniards essentially said that they would protect the Indians in exchange for work, and save them or civilize them by way of Christianizing them. Where this became very what the promise was never the reality. And so essentially Spanish settlers forced long labored and didn't pay their indigenous workers, basically enslaved them, right, and stole their land. And then indigenous people died because of the harsh living and working conditions, and obviously from disease exposure that was brought to them by the Spanish Empire. And so that was very important, that the Encomienda system, although essentially was supposed to be much more of a kind of civilized serfdom between the Spanish Empire and indigenous people, it actually turned into this large race-based system that fundamentally denied the humanity of indigenous people, enslaved them, and exposed them to not only horrific working conditions, but disease that essentially led to their outright genocide. Coupled with the Encomienda system was the Spanish Gasta system, which we did talk a little about within race, but I wanted to go back to this and show you a little bit more detail on this. So the Gasta system was essentially a racial and political classification system, because they recognized that there was so much racial diversity in Latin America. So this is, again, with indigenous folks, with some Asians that were coming in because of the coolie labor system, which we'll talk about in a second, and then with African Americans or Africans that were coming there, we had a complex mixing of individuals in this society, and so the Spanish crown wanted to essentially organize folks by race and political power. So depending on who your parents were, who you were mixed with, would align you within a particular social order, which you can see here on the right in this graph by Goldberg and Dupre, where Peninsulares, who are folks who were born in Spain, had the most political power. Criollos or Creoles, which were white Europeans or white Spaniards who were born in New Spain, but were still largely white, had the next tier of political power. And then mestizos and mulattos, who were basically mixed race individuals with either African Americans or indigenous, were the next tier down. And then lastly, Native Americans and people of African descent were at the bottom, right? And you can see here, obviously, this is the most people with the least power, right? And it kind of goes up from there. The other reason why this system is important to know, which we've been talking a lot about over this semester, is think about this in context with how we've seen the organization of political and citizenship rights for whites in America, right? So if we think about the Peninsulares back in the 15, 16, and 1700s, we're essentially saying that rich white folks here at the top have the most political power, which are also the fewest amount, right? So they're the most narrow organizational group. Criollos, which would be, poor whites. I mean, obviously these folks would have some status or maybe have some wealth above the next tier down, have the next level of political power. So it would go property owning land whites, poor whites. Then we have mixed race folks who are in the next tier down. And then lastly, those historically marginalized communities, which are indigenous folks and Africans or Afro-Latinos in this case, have the least amount of rights, right? And if we see how that articulates today, those structures or that social organization system, that social hierarchy has not changed, right? We still see rich whites at the top, next down is poor whites, then we see people of color, and then that vacillates depending on the political context and who's there. Again, reinforcing that idea that race operates on a continuum and that the closest folks to Blackness have the least political rights, right? So this process of colonization gives rise to mestizo and mestizaje in Latin America. And so mestizo is literally a translation for mixture or mixing. Mestizaje is a cognitive or an intellectual framework around mixed culture or mixed culturation. But again, in definition, it's the largest cultural mixing in the world, which took place in Latin America. Spaniards themselves were already a large mix of cultures. So in Spain, we had Moors, Catalan, Basque, and Arabs due to the Ottoman Empire. In addition to the existing Spaniards, there are actually several other sub-dialects that are spoken in Spain. The Basque people and the Catalans have been trying to secede from Spain for a number of years and actually voted on a referendum, or the Catalonians voted recently to actually secede from Spain. Likewise, about 8 to 10% of the Spanish dialect or Spanish dictionary is Arabic or has Arabic roots. And so there's a lot of overlap from there. And so for folks who speak Spanish and have ever been in a Arabic market, they may hear a lot of root words or roots to their words that sound very similar. And that's largely because there was a lot of cultural exchange and the Ottoman Empire actually colonized Spain at one point. Spanish colonization in the Americas also brought its existing cultures and new ones from various regions. So again, African slaves were coming there. They were bringing their own culture and dialect. And then we also had Asian coolie laborers, which we'll talk about when we get into our Asian American unit, but that was also increasing that diversification there. So you have to recognize that in Latin America, right, you have not only Spaniards who were a multitude of different cultures and spoke a multitude of different languages and had a multitude of different belief structures were here. They're encountering a diversity of indigenous communities, right, that are already in existence, that have their own particular lifeways, languages spoken, so on and so forth, right? Then we're bringing Africans in, right, as a part of the slavery system, which is also redefining that, and then also Asian coolie laborers, right? So Hispanic American colonies, thus, again, were that largest mixing of races and ethnicities in the New World, constituting a variety of folks from all over the world, right? And that's keen in noting, one, because where I think the US did not have the ethnic and cultural diversity until much later, that was already there in existence in Latin America. And what we'll see next in the Latin American push for independence is that the folks that were leading that charge were actually stemming from that diversity. Okay. So Latin American independence starts to happen through the 19th century. And various Latin American, Caribbean communities are starting to liberate themselves, namely from Spain, Portugal, and France, right? And they overwhelmingly control most of the region at this point. Guinea and Haiti are controlled by France at the time. Spain controls a huge swath of Mexico, parts of the Western United States, and parts of Western South America. And then Portugal controls huge swaths of Eastern South America, and Brazil, which is the largest country in Latin America, is fundamentally Portuguese and still has a lot of cultural roots with Portugal. Many of these liberation movements sought to develop a unified Latin America through this sense of solidarity pushed by Simone Bolivar, who I'll give you a little bit more background on in a minute with this short video clip. And it was much more inclusive of people of color and women. Okay, so throughout Latin America, and still to this day, a lot of revolutionary organizations and revolutionary fronts include indigenous people, people of color, and women. They're integral to that. When much of this revolution was happening across Latin America, poor or peasants of color and criollos, who are these Spaniards who were born in Latin America, decided to unite against the Spanish Empire, against the Peninsulares, sort of the elites essentially, and overthrow them. And that type of cross-racial and cross-racial, cross-class, and cross-gender solidarity defines all of Latin American liberation fronts, which was unique from the United States, which, although did allow African and African Americans to fight in the Revolutionary War, they did not necessarily guarantee their full inclusion and citizenship after the revolution. This was different in Latin America, and same thing with women, right? So there was a distinct difference between the two, and this sense of so Simone Bolivar gives way to this idea of Bolivarianism, which actually still guides a lot of revolutionary fronts today. It was a crux for the Cuban Revolution, for one time the Puerto Rican secession movement in 1960, and a lot of socialistic reforms or socialism reforms throughout Latin America, trying to push for governmental reform to de-link Latin America from either Europe or the United States, and provide land and economic reforms that benefited poor Latin Americans at the time. We'll learn a lot about this more in Harvest of Empire, but I wanted to show this short video clip that'll give a bit more history on this.
This is a map of what the Americas looked like at around the year 1750. And as you can see, it was for the most part divided as colonies by a bunch of European powers. Most prominent is Spain. You can see in this peach brownish color. It had control all the way as south as modern day Chile and Argentina, and all the way as far north as modern-day Texas and California. You also see significant control by the Portuguese in what will eventually be Brazil. The French have, at this point, some territory, especially in North America and in several islands in the Caribbean. And the British, of course, have control along the east coast of North America. And they also have several islands in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. As we fast forward 100 years, we're going to see a dramatic change. Notice, roughly 100 years later, most of what used to be these European colonies have now achieved independence. In other videos, we go in some depth from 1776 to 1783. You have the American War for Independence. You see on this map now, the United States is an independent country. From 1791 to 1804, you have Toussaint Louverture lead the revolt against French control, eventually gaining independence and establishing Haiti. From 1807 to 1830, you have a series of revolutions in Latin America, many of which were led by Simone Bolivar, who was a Criollo or Creole, Venezuelan. The term Creole has many meanings in modern day language, but in this context, it refers to someone of mostly Spanish descent who was born in the New World. And Simone Bolivar plays an active role in achieving independence from Spain for Venezuela, what will eventually be Colombia and Panama, Ecuador, Peru, and the country that will eventually be named for him, Bolivia. So there is an interesting question here. What led to all of these revolutions? The map that I showed you before, that colonial map of the Americas, these colonies had been in place for several hundred years before these revolutions. Why did all of these revolutions happen roughly at the same time? Well, one overarching idea is that as we enter into the 1700s, you have the intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. There were many authors and many publications involved in the Enlightenment, but perhaps most famous is the Encyclopédie in French, or encyclopedia, which had the intent of collecting much of the scientific and political science knowledge of the time. And it's considered one of the central texts of the Enlightenment. And it was a series of articles published from the 1750s all the way until the 1770s. And to get a sense of it, here is an excerpt of an article by one of the authors, Denis Diderot, considered one of the primary actors in the Enlightenment. No man has received from nature the right to command others. Liberty is a gift from heaven, and each individual of the same species has the right to enjoy it as soon as he enjoys the use of reason. And so when we get into the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson, he borrows heavily from these ideas of the Enlightenment. Now, the Haitian Revolution was partially inspired by these ideas of the Enlightenment, but they were also helped by the fact that France was undergoing its own revolution at the time, and it was not in the position to exert strong control over a far-flung colony. The French Revolution lasts from 1789 to 1799, at which point Napoleon Bonaparte takes control of France and starts the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon tries to keep control, what would eventually be Haiti, was an incredibly valuable resource. It produced a good chunk of coffee and sugar in the world. It was incredibly profitable for the plantation owners and for France as a nation. But between the ideas of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, the slaves of Haiti, led initially by Toussaint Louverture, were able to overthrow and set up their own nation, which is the first time that this has happened from a successful slave revolt. This is a map of the empire that Napoleon establishes at its peak. And as you see France, but he's able to take over much of modern day Germany, Italy. He goes to war with Portugal and then eventually Spain as well, both significant colonial powers in South America. So it's in this context. You have the Enlightenment as we get into the 1700s. You already have the example of the American War for Independence, 13 colonies being able to declare independence from one of the largest powers at the time. then a successful slave revolt to establish their own country against another significant power. And once Spain and Portugal are fighting Napoleon, coupled with the ideas of the Enlightenment and the examples of the United States and Haiti, it inspires a whole other series of revolts in Latin America, many of which were led by Simone Bolivar. And so by the time we get to 1850, much of the European imperialism in the Americas has come to an end.
And so what this ushers in is a new period in Latin America where tons and tons of shifts are happening, right? So new countries begin to form throughout the region. Mexico gets established, which again takes over much of the Western United States. In addition to that, we start to see Central America form. There is Cuba, there is Puerto Rico, which are starting to gain their own senses of independence. And then obviously the formation of these different countries in South America. As this is starting to kind of congeal or form, there are different issues happening throughout the region, which are causing a lot of social instability. So Spain was trying to regain control over the region and never gave up its own interests in trying to retain its former colonies. And then after the Napoleonic Wars, France also tries to do so. And France actually controls Mexico to a certain extent. You may remember this from Cinco de Mayo, but the battle for Puebla is against the French colonial forces in that town. And the defeat of the French by the Mexican army is lauded as one of the first movements towards independence, although Mexico's independence is actually is September 16th. The US is also trying to capture and control parts of Mexico and New Spain. Frankly, that it's trying to move west to expand slavery and economic development through Manifest Destiny. Industrialization and modernization are also happening, which this becomes complicated because much of these areas were confined to and centered on agriculture. So guano or the harvesting of certain fertilizers was big throughout most of South America. And the shift away from large base agriculture and the shift away obviously from slavery, which was also happening at the time because of abolitionism and so on and so forth, changed the fundamental economic conditions. Industrialization was happening unevenly throughout most of the region, which was also changing the economic tides as well. This period of Latin America marked both the actualization of independence and self-determination as well as social strife. And this is where I'm going to introduce this concept of self-determination, or this belief in the right of people to freely determine their political, social, and economic interests. And whether we look at Toussaint Louverture or Simone Bolivar or other revolutionary icons of the time in this region, following the Enlightenment philosophies, following the sense of social solidarity across Latin America, and this desire to be free of the Spanish Empire, this sense of self-determination and independence emerges, and it is in response to this overwhelming colonialism that has been happening in the Western Hemisphere for roughly about 200 or so years. Shortly after this, and towards the end of the 19th century, the US gets heavily involved in Latin America with two key wars. The first one is the US-Mexico War. This was a war with Mexico to expand into the Southwest. President Polk, or James K. Polk, invades and annexes the newly succeeded Texas territory. Texas had broken away from Mexico and was seeking independence. And its initial desire was to actually be an autonomous country. But President Polk had other motives, essentially, and basically wanted to capture it. And so his annexation of the region at the time provokes an all-out war with Mexico. The issue was that Mexico's population was much more centralized in the south. If you know territorially, Mexico City is further south, and the northern territories are much more sparsely inhabited, and so it was much harder for Mexico to move north to engage in this war with the U.S., which had formidable forces, and they were ramping up and escalating for the Civil War, right, at the time. Likewise, the United States had a huge amount of resources and wealth, largely because of the chattel slavery system that had, flourished in that antebellum period. The primary purposes of this war, although it's talked about in very nascent terms, I want to be very clear, was to expand slavery and westward expansion, which were basically the same thing. The U.S. had, adopted this idea of manifest destiny, that it was their, rights by God to capture most of the West, right, to civilize and Christianize the land and take all of its resources, and did so with a lot of ferocity. It's very important to note that the U.S.-Mexico War actually enables a lot of wealth building in the United States, not only for the purposes of slavery, but we have to also think about what were some of the natural resources in those regions, namely that there were huge swaths of gold and oil in Texas and in California, which allowed, again, for the burgeoning of the U.S. economic force, which allowed it to engage in other military skirmishes for land and resources. Shortly after the U.S.-Mexico War is the Spanish-American War. This is a war with Spain over the Caribbean and the Philippine territories. President McKinley backs the Island Revolutions for Independence against the Island Revolution independence movements from Spain. This is a little bit complicated because while the U.S. recognized and wanted to allow for these independent movements, it did so with a kind of two-faced kind of framework. The U.S. primarily wants to influence or expand its influence into the Atlantic and Pacific regions, and in doing so, or coupled with these desires, it actually retains the Philippines and Puerto Rico as a colony. Puerto Rico is still a commonwealth of the U.S. Commonwealth is a very fancy term for colony. It's not the same kind of framework. The Philippines are considered to be a commonwealth for a number of years, and then due to heavy immigration from the Philippines in the early 20th century, there's a debate and eventually decision by Congress to withdraw formal control, although we still have a lot of influence in the Philippines, have numerous military bases, and use the Philippines as a staging ground for a war with Asia, or have been doing so for a number of years. And because of this, Puerto Rico and the Philippines become these awkward colonial subjects where they don't have a lot of rights and are essentially expected to live, under this kind of Americanistic lifestyle. English become very common languages there. Puerto Rico, although overwhelmingly Spanish in its initial colonization, has all of its schools converted to English. Tagalog, which was the indigenous language of the Philippines, was already destroyed because of Spanish colonialism in there. Many of the Filipinos, retain Spanish surnames as part of their last names. Many of them are forced to speak Spanish and then eventually English because of U.S. colonization. And both the Philippines and Puerto Rico are heavily dependent on U.S. economic resources. Cuba was similar to this, as with the Dominican Republic, which we'll learn a little bit more about in Harvest of Empire. But it wasn't until Fidel Castro and the Castro/Cuban Revolution that we saw one particular territory try to break away from U.S. control, and Latin American countries since the Spanish-American Wars have been struggling for their own sense of self-determination away from the U.S. and from European powers for a number of years, since this point. So after this, we give rise to the US Southwest and this emergent idea of Mexican American. So the US and Mexico established a treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1865. I'm sorry, in 1856. And this is to, basically establish peace between the two countries. It also provides new rights for Mexicans or Mexican Americans. And there are important parameters that I want to note here. One, Article 8, which allowed for two different caveats. The ability for people to retain their property in the region if they were Mexican citizens. So you could stay in your property after the war. You could also do what was called absentee land ownership. If you wanted to leave to Mexico or leave back to Mexico, you could reside in Mexico and still retain your land in the US, or you could sell your property outright and get the full amount for that, right? Article 8 also allows Mexican citizens to remain citizens with protections or become citizens. So they're either allowed to become Mexican citizens and still have some legal protected status, meaning they wouldn't be deported, harassed, or mistreated, or they would be allowed to become citizens, okay? And then lastly, Article 10, which was eventually deleted, ensured Mexican and Mexican Americans would have guaranteed land rights and claims in Texas and other areas of the Southwest. However, this was deleted because the US government did not want to ensure that Mexicans could retain their land, specifically because Manifest Destiny was kind of the guiding framework for this westward expansion. And they didn't, the US government did not want to allow Mexicans to retain that land because they wanted to be able to provide that for settlers that were moving west. So this short video will give a little bit more detail on this.
In this unit, let's discuss the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The treaty had two main objectives. The first objective was to bring to end the US-Mexico War. And the second objective was to establish civic and property rights for the people of Mexican descent, now part of the United States. Now, you might think this is an easy thing to do, but it's not. Consider the following, for example. It is not easy to end a war. You would think it is, but it is not easy to end a war. And more typical is, how do you establish civic and property rights for former Mexican nationals? Consider this. You have people who are in the same house, the same street, the same town where they were born. In fact, where their parents were born, their grandparents were born. And now, without moving anywhere, they are part of a different nation. So what is their future? What will they be seen as by now in the new social order? That's the question. Are they Mexicans? Are they Americans? Will they be seen as possible slaves? That's an important question when it comes to the civic and the property rights of people of Mexican descent that was being negotiated and agreed upon eventually in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Let's discuss the units more clearly. Let's look at the most important articles that pertain to the Mexican American experience of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Articles 1, 5, 8, 9, and 10. So as we can see, Article 1 is very simple. It's about establishing peace between the United States and Mexico. You might be surprised how many more times after this treaty was signed, both nations were at the brink of war. As you can see, Article 5 is quite large. Let's try to summarize it into a few sentences. Article 5 primarily, what it does, it establishes a new boundary between the United States and Mexico in 1848. When you cross the US-Mexico border currently, the current border, you might find a flag that says 1853 because of the Gasta Treaty a few years later. But most of the border that we have now between the United States and Mexico was established by Article 5 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So Article 5, again, establishes a new border and in doing so, will surrender over half of the Mexican territory to the United States, including the territories that became states such as California, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, a bit of Wyoming, of course, and then there's Texas. Most historians will conclude the most important articles that protect the civic and property rights were Articles 8 and 9. This is called Article 8 now. As you have seen, it has two main sections to it. The first section deals with property. What will happen to your property? The first thing you can do is stay where you now reside. Consider the fact that you have been in the same house your family has for generations. So the first thing you can do is stay where you currently reside. The second option is to leave the country, go back to maybe Mexico during the war or during the post-war period, but protecting your property ownership. This is called absentee land ownership, and it's very, very important. It allows you to go somewhere else and seek refuge while maintaining the ownership of your property in the United States. And the third option you have is to sell the land, sell your property, and remove yourself to Mexico. The second part of Article 8 is very, very important because it deals with civic rights. The question is this: what happens to the status, if you will, the civic status of the former Mexican nationals? These were people who were Mexicans in Mexican territory, and without moving anywhere else, are now in a different country in the United States. So what is going to be their status? In Article 8, Section 2, we're looking at the promise of the American government that these folks have a choice. One, they can remain Mexican citizens, but be US residents, kind of like green card holders in a sense, or they can become US citizens. They have a choice. And they are given a year to make the decision. Otherwise, it was assumed they want to become US citizens. Article 8 is very promising. There will be, as you have read in these chapters in our literature, a lot of problems with this article, Section 2. For example, most of the people who lived in the American territories of the Southwest before Mexico's Northwestern territories were Native Americans, who the Mexican government saw as citizens of the Mexican Republic, but the United States would not see them as possible US citizens. Article 9 is very interesting as well. The main objective of the article is to try to establish the proper time of inclusion. And we see that when we now have a bit more clearance when it says that it will be judged by Congress. So again, main idea is when will the choice given in Article 8 be executed? Article 9 says at the proper time to be judged by Congress. That in itself will lead to other problems, as we'll see as we go forward. As you can see, Article 10 was deleted by the United States, much to the anger of the Mexican government. The main reason for that was that Article 10 protected the property rights and land rights of Mexicanos in Texas. This is something the United States could not simply accept. We hope you have enjoyed the articles of the Treaty of Alvidad.
And while this is very brief, what I want to stress with this video by Dr. Jacobo is that there were a lot of provisions in place for these individuals in the new, U.S. or the secession of Mexico to, or Mexican territories to the U.S. However, a lot of this was not necessarily actualized, and what we really see is a retrenchment from rights or this kind of this absence of rights for Mexican citizens shortly after this period. So Mexican Americans now become a new class of people. They were essentially not white citizens and were also no longer Mexicans. This created a condition within frontier violence, which, or the frontier, which defines much of the relationship between white settlers and Mexican Americans. As Americans expand west, the land is mostly lawless, where both law enforcement allowed for the extra legal, where law enforcement allowed for the extra legal killing of Mexican bandits, right? And I provided some photos here of Texas Rangers and other lawmen lynching Mexican Americans or Mexican quote unquote bandits. And I asked the question here, what does this killing / lynching of criminalized men of color remind us of, right? And we have to think back to that convict leasing system, and even today with our systems of mass incarceration, where the carte blanche or the killing with impunity of individuals, or in particularly men of color, because of their subordinated social status or their racialized social status, has allowed for this. And actually, what's very notable, and this you'll see in this top picture here that I provided, as a part of Mexican, or sorry, not Mexican, as a part of California lore, one of the first lynchings to happen in California was of a woman, a Latina woman. Her name was Josefa. And there's a great book about this called Unspeakable Violence, where this woman, whose last name isn't given, and there's a lot of infamy around her case. She was at one considered to be a prostitute, and on another hand considered to be a worker. She's accosted by a white miner in this area of California. This leads to a small physical altercation, and the white miner basically complains to law enforcement that this person had assaulted her, and it allows for her lynching, or it enables her lynching. And much of what was going on in the West was a type of, kind of shoot first and ask question later, largely because, one, the interconnectivity of the actual government, the federal government, to these land areas was not as rich or as meaningful as necessary. And remember that in the late 1800s, there was a lot of political strife, which leads to the end of the Freedmen's Bureau, which ends to the legal protections for African Americans in the South. So as this territory is expanding in the West, there's the same kind of lack of concern for people of color in this area. And as a result, this creates a condition where, if you are caught doing something wrong, you essentially could just be killed for that, and no real recompense for this, or no investigation by federal agencies or federal enforcement. And that's where I showed you that statistic very early on about the comparability for lynching rates between African Americans and Mexican Americans, because their liminal racial status actually creates the conditions to where they can be killed with impunity. And because the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is never fully enforced, we see a lot of discrimination and mistreatment happen shortly after the US-Mexico War. So while this is happening, we're also seeing a big push for Mexican immigration into the United States. So in the turn of the 20th century, we start to see a big bump in Mexican immigration. This is largely because there's going to be another revolution fought in Mexico in 1910. And we also have World War I that happens shortly after the Spanish-American War. This creates an ongoing relationship where Mexican nationals are encouraged to move north to fill labor demands. And although this larger chart shows the kind of general trend and tick up of individuals immigrating to the US from 1909 to 2009, or from a 1900 to 1909 period to 2000, 2009, we can see a big blip here, right? Where there's a big presence of Mexico's legal permanent residents and Mexican-born residents here in the US. And that kind of being around that time frame that I was mentioning. This begins again that complex relationship between the U.S. government needing Chicanx and Latinx migrant labor, and these individuals having to come north due to social instability. And this is, again, is what we're talking about. We're talking about push and pull migration, right? So again, push factors are, what are the factors in the country that are pushing folks away, right? And so in this case, it is this revolution that's happening, social instability that's going on in Mexico, so on and so forth, right? Secondly, we also see this pull happening because as America is starting to engage in this war, we see Mexicans being asked to come north. And I provided this flyer here where we can see, this kind of unison between Mexican nationals and, Uncle Sam, right? So, or this idea of the kind of Mexican worker and the American, right? So Americanos todos luchamos por la victoria, and this idea that Americans for all, let's all fight for victory, right? And we can see here an example of Mexican farm workers coming north off of trains during this 1900s or this early 1900s period. Sadly, though, despite the need and desire for Mexican nationals here in the United States, we did not see these folks welcomed, nor treated with the dignity or equality that was, one, guaranteed by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, nor under the ethos of kind of helping migrants settle in the U.S. So again, remember that we've seen Mexican Americans lynched at comparable rates in the Southwest as African Americans, and so racial violence was overwhelmingly being targeted at this group because they were the larger demographic in the area compared to African Americans. Chicanx and Latinx mixed race ancestry again kicked them out of that social and legal whiteness. So they faced discrimination and segregation at comparable rates. And then with the Great Depression of the 1930s, Mexicans actually became the focus of social and economic woes, and the government acted by establishing the Mexican Repatriation program. And so rather than understanding that the unfettered system of capitalism, which had allowed for this oligarchical class and who bet on the stock market the wrong way and crashed the economy, rather than looking at the system or those players or those actors, the U.S. turned its attention on Mexicans and attempted to deport them as a means of creating the other and creating the person to hate. And so the Mexican Repatriation Program happens from 1929 to 1939, roughly the span of the Great Depression, and about 500,000 to 2 million Mexicans were deported. Numbers are difficult to assess out because obviously record keeping at the time was very wasn't as good as it needed to be. And actually 2/3 of those folks were actually US citizens. And I put Mexicans in quotations here, largely because one, many of those folks who were deported were US citizens. And also because the US does not have what we would consider good race literacy or a good race lens. And what I mean by that is anybody who looks brown or has a Hispanic surname, oftentimes by the common person in the United States, is just considered to be Mexican, because Mexicans have by and large been one of the largest demographic groups or Latinx demographic groups here in the US. However, we know that there are a variety of folks here from a variety of different Latino countries or Latin American countries. And so oftentimes in these big sweeps to deport people, many other folks who are become swept up in that inappropriately. And that's happened even today, where we've had US born, or American citizens who are Latino be caught up in immigration raids and in turn in ICE detention centers, right? And what I provided here on the right is some examples of segregation, either flyering and or newspapering, that shows the kind of racism that was present at the time. Here in California, we had this whites, we serve whites only. This park is for white people only, Mexican and Negro stay out. Here in El Paso, Texas, right, in 1929, again, at the start of this program, no dogs, Negroes, and Mexicans, another example of segregation. And these newspaper clippings show how in Oklahoma and in Los Angeles, there was a big push to deport people back to Mexico, right? And so again, this is a part of a larger trend, which will actually set the framework for civil rights movements that we'll see in the next couple of years. And so at the same time that we were seeing the convict leasing system happen in the US, which was again enslaving or re-enslaving Africans, we also had a big push to bring in Mexicans as cheap labor to to support the war effort, to support the burgeoning American society. But those folks were also treated as second-class citizens, like African Americans were under the Jim Crow and Black Codes system. So with that, we've kind of gone over a lot of material. So we've talked about what is Chicanx and Latinx, what is early Mesoamerican and indigeneity in the continental or the Western Hemisphere, how Spanish colonial rule shaped race, the emergence of mestizo and mestizaje, this push for Latin American independence and the new Latin America, U.S. involvement in Latin America and the U.S. Southwest shortly after specific wars, and then lastly, Chicanx migration and racialization in the early 20th century. And again, those key terms for today are mestizo, self-determination, and push-pull and migration. With that, I'll leave it there, and I'll see you guys next time.